All right, yes, like she said, my name is Gregory Phillips. Today I'm going to be speaking with you a bit about how some successful startups have been built and how we can use those findings to propel our future startups going forward. All right, so we're going to talk about some original startups. So the first three that we're going to go over are Hewlett-Packard, known as HP, Oracle, and Sun Microsystems. Now these were really foundational companies in the early days of technology. HP was founded in 1939 by David Packard and Bill Hewitt. Oracle, 1977, by Larry Ellison, Ed Oates, and Bob Miner. And Sun Microsystems in 1982, Scott McNealy, Vinod Khosla, Andy Beck, and Bill Joy. Hewlett-Packard is known as the company that started Silicon Valley. They started in a garage in Palo Alto, California, and they started out making audio oscillators, and they later moved on into other forms of electronic test equipment. A little fun fact about them, they produced audio oscillators for the early Disney films, so Disney worked hand in hand with them to develop the sound production for Fantasia that was released in 1940. So that was one of their earliest customers. And since then, they've been very integral, known for their advances in technology. Personal computers in the mid-1960s, handheld calculators in the mid-70s, and finally, the desktop laser printer that we all use today to print off things. That was in 1984. And they are still widely known today for their commercial production of personal computers and their printers. Part two, we're going to be moving on into Oracle. Now, Oracle is known as kind of the titan or the king of database. Their story begins, actually, surprisingly, at IBM, another technology company, with a computer scientist by the name of Edgar F. Codd. Now, Codd hypothesized about this relational database model that would essentially be a better way to store and access information. And at IBM, they weren't really concerned with pursuing that at that particular time, so they kind of shelved it. Well, the crafty founders of Oracle took this idea and thought, hey, we can make something out of this. So they essentially partnered this up with SQL, and they created a product that would allow businesses to store and retrieve data electronically. And this would save time. This would allow them to modify and add data very easily, and would also allow them to retrieve data very easily. You can really not overstate how big this was. It sounds very simple, and it sounds very somewhat boring. But this is a very big part of the technology you see today. And database science was fundamental in the development of the whole tech scene that we see today. So a little bit more about Oracle. They were big on hopping on to the next trend. So in the early days of the World Wide Web, what most of us would now know as the internet, they developed technologies that would be usable on there. So you could use them from anywhere in the world, from any computer. They had this vision that was, really ahead of their time, in the early 90s and that sort of thing. And being ahead of their time, they would also spot companies that were on the up and up, that were doing things that they couldn't necessarily innovate as fast as them, so they would acquire them. Some of these acquisitions, PeopleSoft, NetSuite, Java, which is actually an early programming language that was actually one of the first that allowed computer code to be written on one computer and not have to be recoded for others. So it allowed this kind of transfer of data and code between computers very simply. And a little fun fact, that's actually what an early iteration of Facebook was coded in, and it's still used today on some of their user interface stuff. And then finally, their acquisition of the future startup we'll talk about, Sun Microsystems, and their subsidiary, MySQL, which, if you remember, is what they used to create their original Oracle relational database. These acquisitions really helped to boost their profitability, to increase their market share, and to quell competition, essentially taking out competitors by bringing them in-house and having them build for them. And today it's estimated that Oracle controls around 42% of the relational database market, which is a massive multi-billion-dollar market. And finally, for this past part of the presentation here, Sun Microsystems, which was, as we stated, acquired by Oracle in 2009. Sun was known for making computing more approachable to the everyday person. They specialized in computer components, computers themselves, storage and server devices. They began kind of experimenting. They needed funding, so they went out and found customers who they could build equipment for. It was kind of a novel idea at the time, and they became the original equipment manufacturer. Essentially, these companies would pay them to develop technology for them. They'd sell it to the companies who would then license it under their own brand name, selling it for themselves. And they had this agreement with Computer Vision, Kodak, American Telephone and Telegraph, now known as AT&T, and Xerox. And then they kept on innovating and developing. And in 1984, they developed the file system software, or network file system software, sorry. And this is essentially like an early iteration of Google Docs. It allowed files to be shared amongst a network, which we would take for granted today. But in 1984, this was a very big deal. And as previously stated, they introduced Java in '95. So the impact of these companies was really the creation of kind of the foundation for the technological sector that we see today. They really created kind of the roadmaps, kind of the path for them to take, and they've also discovered the potholes and ways around them that tech companies use today to run further and faster than before. They continue to innovate today in various capacities, all besides Sun, who is acquired by Oracle, but their intellectual property and patents are still being exercised by Oracle today. They solidified the startup in Silicon Valley, kind of that tech sphere of where you have companies like Facebook, Google, and many others all congregating to this area where the brightest minds, venture capital, and just kind of the energy, so to speak, of tech startups. And then modern companies, as mentioned before, still follow in their footsteps. They're still using these same rules and kind of same modus operandi as these companies did almost 100 years ago. All right, so before we get into the present day startups, we're going to talk about something about Moore's Law. Now essentially Moore's Law, it's not really a law at all. It's more of an empirical relationship spotted by a computer scientist by the name of Gordon Moore in the early 1960s. Essentially, in layman's terms, it's the doubling of computer power and the halving of cost every 2 years. And if you take a look at this graph, I believe this is in the 1980s in the beginning, and then as it goes up into the 2010 region, it's millions and millions of times faster for less money. And just to give you a little bit of a tangible evidence of this, an iPhone, a standard iPhone today, with 4 gigabytes of RAM, it's around 1 million times better, faster, stronger than the navigation, the guidance system that they had on Apollo 11. So what we entrusted astronauts to get to the moon and back with was 1 million times less powerful than the phone you use to look at memes. So it's kind of interesting to see how far we've come in such a short period of time, relatively. So as we move forward with that knowledge, these companies all use this advancing in technology at a very fast rate, and they use it to kind of put themselves in a position to where they could build a business very fast. So we're going to go over 3 major ones right here. The first one is Dell Computer, started by Michael Dell in 1984. The second one is Amazon, founded by Jeff Bezos in 1994. And the third is Google, founded by Larry and Sergey Brin in 1998. So to start off a little bit about Dell Computer, Michael Dell really set out to disrupt this personal computer industry. He foresaw a future in which people would go home and have a computer on their desk at the end of the day, not just a workstation at their office, because you got to understand in this time in the early 1980s, computers were really either for the hardcore hobbyist or for people who just absolutely had to use them in an office setting for some form of crunching data or something else. They were not really, just go home and fire up your computer. That wasn't a normal thing back in the day. So he came out with his first product, the Turbo PC, and this really got a lot of buzz, and a lot of people who had never been in the computer market were now suddenly trying to look into seeing maybe, hey, what is this newfangled technology, and what is it capable of? So one of the things he did to offer, or to boost sales, was to offer risk-free returns. Now you have to think at the time, computers weren't as common, so people had a little bit of adversity to them in the sense of they didn't know exactly what they could do, what their use case was, or what they'd be useful for. So by him offering this risk-free return, if they didn't like it, if they couldn't figure out how to use it, they could return it, no problem. So this really helped him to get a little bit of get his customers to sign on, even if they weren't 100% sure. And in the end, they almost always ended up liking it. So he acquired customers using his trust that he gained and the insight he gained from also helping them out every step of the way. He would go to the customers' houses in the early days and set up their computers for them free of charge. And this aided him in gaining insight into the customer's mind. What did they want? What problems were they having? And what were they looking for? And he could answer those questions in the future in later product launches. So he used this insight to continually build this business until 1996, he launched Dell.com. Now, Dell.com was an internet marketplace for laptops, personal computers, and that sort of thing. And this was a really big deal at the time because not only were there not many online stores, there weren't many online stores offering, laptops and computers shipped to you. So this really put some fuel on the fire, so to speak. And in 1999, Dell was ranked #1 in PCs in the whole entire United States. And he really built this business up on fair prices, quality service, and great products that you could trust in. And he really fostered a lot of trust in the American people towards computers. Moving on, Jeff Bezos kind of saw this growth in the computer market, in the internet user market. He could see year-over-year internet user growth in 1,000% increases. So he saw this and he thought, what would be a good business in this environment? So he reviewed products with high SKU counts. Now, a SKU is just a stock keeping unit. If you go into a grocery store and you see, 10 different types of soda on the line, that's a SKU. It's a different product. So he wanted to find something that had many products because physical retailers could not hold them all. So he could beat them just on choice. So he decided to go into books because no Barnes and Noble could store every book available. So he could do that. He could do this because he's decentralized. And in the beginning, he would get books shipped to him and then ship them out to the consumer. And this really allowed him to have a competitive advantage against the big box stores that he was trying to take down. And after he validated this business model, that he could actually make money and make this work, he moved on into computer games and music in 1998, and then finally toys in 1999, partnering with Toys R Us for a big holiday event. And during this time, we saw revenue jump from almost $148 million in 1997 to almost $2.8 billion in 2000. So we have massive growth in just 3 short years. This is really due to a lot of things, but one of the major ones being product expansion. He would slowly, Amazon as a whole, would slowly gobble up market share in different pockets of the market. Just slow and steady, and they would consistently hit the mark. And this would allow them to increase revenue and kind of create somewhat of a product network effect. Now you might know of like a network effect from Facebook, meaning that if you have 10 friends compared to if you have 20 friends on the platform, if you have 20 friends, the platform's now more valuable because there's more people to talk to, and there's more things to do. Similar with products. When there's 10 choices, it's kind of limited. But if there's 1 million choices on what you can buy on Amazon.com, it becomes much more feasible to use it because you can buy, diapers were a big thing in the beginning, toys, cosmetics, all in one place, shipped to your door, and it becomes a lot more feasible. So Amazon Part 2. It's really built on 3 pillars. 1 is low price, 2 is fast shipping, and 3, as mentioned previously, the largest selection available. And that's really the tenets that they try to stick to. And like Walmart from the past, Amazon works diligently to keep the cost low because they can pass on these cost savings to customers in low prices, creating an even better competitive advantage. And then finally, another one of Amazon's really big strengths are its consistent innovation. So we see innovation in multiple different forms in warehousing, for example, to make the pick and pack process of where people normally would have to go find a product, bring it back, and then box it up. They have robots. They actually acquired it. It's called Kiva Technologies. And it's essentially a little robot that goes over, picks up the case of products, brings it to the individual to pick off the storage container and into the box. And it's saved their time about 300% in employee cost and just wasted time walking to and from because the robots are faster and more efficient. So that's one way they've used innovation to cut down on cost. The second way is delivery. They have Prime Air. They've tested with delivery vehicles. They've acquired an ownership percentage in Rivian, an electric vehicle startup, all towards this kind of vertical integration from supplier to delivery. They want that to be Amazon. Thirdly, we have return policies. So during the pandemic, as everybody I'm sure remembers, they had this kind of, they were testing out a new return policy in the sense of, they call it a no return policy. So for certain products that it's too expensive for them to deal with the return shipping and then restocking and everything, they'll just allow the customer to keep it, and they'll still give you the return fee. So if you buy a hat that costs $10, you don't have to send the hat back in, but you get refunded the $10. If for some reason it didn't live up to your expectations. So that's kind of interesting. And then they also use consumer data as a very big lever in which they can generate actionable insights to predict consumer behavior, to better their sales process, and to increase consumer satisfaction. And the final part of Amazon, they followed in Oracle's footsteps through some great acquisitions. So they acquired Audible, the audiobook company, in 2008, Zappos, the online shoe store, in 2009, Twitch, the online streaming platform mainly used for gaming, in 2014, Whole Foods, this actually got them into retail in 2014. That was their largest acquisition. That was almost $14 billion. Ring, which is a video doorbell, and then PillPack in 2018 as well, and they're essentially an online pharmacy. So some pretty cool acquisitions, and a lot of these are operating, and they operate profitably. If you want to learn a little bit more about Amazon, personally I geek out over this a little bit. I would recommend the book by Brad Stone called The Everything Store. He goes into a little bit more detail about stuff. They talk about the two-pizza team, the DoorDash mentality, how it's always day one, and a lot more that I think you would find interesting. And it's estimated today that Amazon owns about 37% of the online e-commerce market, which is amazing, just amazing. All right, and the final present-day company we'll be going over, Google. Now, Google really set out in the early days to conquer internet search. There were some search engines out on the market before them. However, Google had a plan to do it better. So they developed this algorithm they called PageRank at the time, and this was back when their name was still Backrub before they changed it to Google. So essentially what PageRank did was it allowed them to send out web crawlers and to acquire information about a site from either keywords or links to that site from other sites. So essentially, if a site referenced another, the site that was referenced was viewed as, in a hierarchical structure, higher and or more authoritative on the topic. So it would get pushed up higher in the rankings. So they used this relatively simple algorithm to make, better filtered search. They tried to sell this to Yahoo on 2 separate occasions and got turned down both times. And this was because at the time, Yahoo made a lot of their money by users aimlessly scrolling around on their website trying to find what they were looking for. So they didn't see how this direct approach from Google would really make sense, or in this case, dollars. So Larry and Sergey decided to build out the product themselves. They, like I said, indexed the website with web crawlers, assigned rankings, and then they did a test at Stanford where they were college students, and they found out that it did in fact provide users with a better experience, and they wanted more of it. So they thought, okay, let's do a launch. But one thing about a launch is sometime the business has got to make money. So they had to figure out a way to monetize this venture. So they stumbled upon this idea of just doing non-intrusive ads after they kind of reviewed a lot of websites, and they didn't really like the banner ads that pop up on the side, especially when you have 756K dial-up. Everything was really laggy back in the 1990s. So they decided on these little text ads right below the search bar. So if you were searching for something, say, a pair of black dress shoes, they would show you the results, but above your results, they would have 3 ads, from ABC Shoe Company, XYZ Shoe Company, and then maybe a blog talking about, the best shoes you can get for under $150. And these ads did a couple of things. They caused higher conversions because they were targeted search. It showed intent. When people are looking for black shoes, the chances that they're in the market for a pair of black shoes are much higher than if they were searching for, horse feed or something along those lines. And the other thing, this generated higher prices for Google. They could charge more because these customers were converting. The advertisers were making money off their products, so Google could afford to charge them more, and the advertisers would stay. And to kind of create a free market approach to this, they made an ad auction, which essentially had the buyers regulate the pricing. So whatever the buyers thought it was worth, that's what they paid. There was nobody on Google's side saying that this is the price that it had to be. It was free-flowing. This really simplified the ad buying process, and this maximized revenue for Google. I actually listened to a podcast with the former CEO, and he said that in the first month that they ran this test of not having salesmen sell the ads at a set price, but having this free market, they actually tripled revenue in a month. And this is a billion-dollar company, so it's a big deal. And this also helped facilitate in-depth targeted advertising. So the user data that they collect was used to target them in the end, and it provided users with a more kind of a la carte personalized data, or personalized advertisements, and it provided advertisers with higher converting ads. And following in Oracle's footsteps, Google is also known for some very well-timed mergers in the form of YouTube, the online video search engine, Android, the mobile operating system, Fitbit, the wearables company, Waze, a user input GPS application, and then Nest, a home automation setup, sort of like Ring that was acquired by Amazon. They're kind of in the same market. So finally, we're going to talk about some rules to innovate by. Now, all of these startups have had along similar lines of things that they've followed. Now, no startup's going to be the same, and there's no set rule necessarily for what a startup must do to be successful. But some of these are gleaned from the major findings of what we see throughout all these startups. So according to Belletti, problem scope, knowledge about a question and its answer that are important to a large and growing number of individuals and/or organizations are important. So essentially, this just means that your product should be as ubiquitous as possible. As many people should want it, because that ensures that you'll actually have a market. So if you think Google, how many people want to know, the answers to their questions at any given time? Well, it's billions of searches a day, so a lot. Amazon, how many people want, 2-day or even 1-day shipping, on millions of products? A lot. So you're trying to find a large target market that has a large upside and that people actually get something out of it. Number 2, they consistently improve and overcome their challenges. So progress is iteration, and iteration is not luck. They don't fall to the top of the mountain. They build up slowly and slowly and slowly, and each iteration, each spin of the flywheel propels them further and further until they're in their own league. Thirdly, customers care about selection, price, and their time. A really good example of this is Amazon, as quoted by R.L. Brandt in his book Amazon and One Click. It really shows the importance of the cumulative effects of small innovations. So a good one to talk about here is Amazon's one-click button. Now, in the late 1990s, Amazon had this idea to make it as seamless as possible for a consumer to identify an item they want and to check out. So they decided, let's just make it one button. We have their account information stored. They'll click one button, and the item will show up, magically 3 days later. It'll be like, nothing. It just is seamless. So they patented that idea, and it was a relatively broad-reaching patent. It's estimated that was about a couple $1 billion decision because it wasn't crucial as a matter of just one click, but it shows the overall iteration cycle of these little things that add up over time that create a $1 trillion company or create something that has a profound impact on the users. And then fourth, innovation does not always come from within. As we've seen through a lot of these companies, they have a lot of well-timed acquisitions. This really helps to bolster the company's offerings, their balance sheet, their profitability, really helps them go far. If they can't innovate from within, you should seek outside companies that are disrupting. And this also helps them to get into a market or embolden their position. Unilever and a lot of other companies are really well known for this. If they can't break into a market themselves, They acquire a company, at a slight multiple of what they're worth, and they build it out themselves, and it's profitable for them. And then lastly, to quote Jeff Bezos, it's always day one. You should never get complacent. They always act, they always act with this mentality of we're starting from zero every day. So they continue to innovate and continue to run, not scared, but just very knowledgeable with, who they're competing against, and if they stop running, somebody else is going to catch up and pass them. So, to talk about only the good with startups without mentioning some of the bad. So, a little bit of the problem with growth at all cost can put some companies into some kind of precarious situations. So, we can avoid doing these by always operating with our consumer in mind. The customer is your boss if you're an entrepreneur. They decide your fate. You can present the best product, the best service, but at the end of the day, it is up to them to do business with you. And if you do something that makes them not want to do business with you, they're free to go other places, as they should. Secondly, treat all employees fairly as they make the magic happen. Don't get complacent. The person that's manning the phone call, to a customer is more important than the CEO in that situation. Nobody cares who the CEO is if they're, you're an angry customer trying to get your thing to work. So treat all your employees fairly as, they're your front line, they're the face of the company, and they make the magic happen, and they make the business. Run a lean operation. Avoid unconducive spending. A flashback to that Brad Stone book. In the early days of Amazon, they actually found it was cheaper to make doors into desk than to buy, desk from a normal store. So they would just screw 4x4s, 4 of them into the bottom of a door, and that was actually, a kind of a running joke at their company. I believe Jeff Bezos still has kind of like a mock-up. It's a fancier door desk, but yeah, it's still a door desk, and it always reminds them, avoid unconducive spending wherever possible. And then finally, as we move forward into this field of technology, it's a lot about keeping data secure. You hear about, it seems like a new hack, once a week or once a month. And so it's very important to be both proactive with your company's data and your consumers' data, because it's bad for everybody. So it makes sense to invest in the best cybersecurity teams, the best in-house security to ensure that everybody is safe, because you don't want to face the consequences otherwise. And then lastly, does anybody have any questions? I think it's short-sighted, because research and development really makes them. Now, unconductive research and development, it's like a stop loss at that point. But if your job is to innovate, as most companies are, and you see a return over time, it only makes sense to invest heavily into research and development, because you're kind of selling yourself short. You're selling the future for now, which doesn't make sense for any company that wants to grow. So I believe that would be a rational move. This study was limited to current and past companies, obviously. So in the future, it could be updated with insights gleaned from future companies going forward. You can kind of retrospectively look at things, but you can't necessarily project as easily. And one of the cool things, this is actually an extra quote I just happen to have. The paradox of teaching entrepreneurship is that such a formula for innovation cannot exist, because every innovation is new and unique. No authority can prescribe in concrete terms how to be more innovative. And that's from Peter Thiel, 0 to 1. He was the co-founder of PayPal. And that essentially talks about how there is no path to entrepreneurship. There is no path to success. There's only kind of mile markers. And within those mile markers, you have to find your own way. But there is no, pass go, collect $200, then go here, then go here. You kind of got to find your way, but once you get there, you're there. And if you're building towards something that's important, that you believe is needed in the world, you'll make it happen. Well, as far as antitrust goes, a lot of these companies are so far flung, and they're in so many industries that it's hard to necessarily pin them down on, an antitrust. Like for Amazon, for example, they sell everything. Walmart, they sell everything. So how are you going to necessarily pin them down on one thing? That's not a question for me. That'd be for the Supreme Court. But I do feel like they can kind of circumvent some of the problems by continuously offering customers and their employees, the best. Fair wages, fair work practices, fair cost for employees. Because normally what you see kind of in a monopolistic sector is they kill out all their competition, and then they either raise prices, do something negative to the workers, or somehow make the business have a negative impact for society. Now, if you can maintain kind of a subjective but albeit positive, impact on society of a company, that's really all you can ask of anything, no matter how big they get. If they're still having a net positive result, I believe you should let it go. However, you should foster innovation, and you should not allow these incumbents to squash, forward movement into the progression of the future. It seems like the startups that are really good, they always find some hack at the time. Now, like you saw it in the beginning, when Sun Microsystems couldn't acquire funding, they were a couple broke college kids. They were trying to think of some way to fund their venture. So they went out to companies and they said, hey, we'll build your products for you better, faster, stronger, but we need money up front because we're just you don't lie. Like, we're just a couple poor college kids, we're feisty, we'll make it happen, but we need the money to make it happen. We promise we'll go all the way for you. And they signed these contracts, they proved that they could actually perform, and then everybody would give them money at that point because they could make better products and supply the best to the best. So it was a no-brainer to do business with them at that point. But it is kind of a cart before the horse problem of you need funding to operate, but you need to operate to get money. So at the time, normally it seems like some crafty way to answer the question is how to do it. Anything else? Thank you very much, guys.